Hello. So we are in the midst of our Unit 5 on perspectives. And this is a really cool unit because we are looking at social science and social studies concepts from like a big lens and seeing how do we see the world and how can our perspective change and how is it affected by things like culture and other people and information that we get. So one big part of representing information in social science and social studies is with data. And you've worked with data and variables and experiments in science, but we do the same kinds of procedures when we study social things and social concepts to try to understand people and how society works and to make society better. So today we're looking at some of the data, and I've got a series of little videos that we'll look at to see how we represent data, how we manipulate data in a good way, and how it can be manipulated in a bad way. So let's start with this question. How do we represent information in social science? So a lot of that is with numbers, statistics, data. So looking at these questions, which of these is a statistical question where data analysis is actually possible? How many girls in your science class were born in July? How many students in your science class were born in each month of the year? How many students in your science class were born in May? So hopefully you can see that there's like a difference in the answers here, where B is the only one that gives us more than one answer. If you have one datum, that's the singular word for data, then there's no analysis possible. You can't like make a graph of one number. You can't find averages or anything. So for statistical questions, we're looking for questions that produce a lot of information. So to be a statistical question, it has to be a lot of information. And statistics is really about finding patterns. So we take a look at that data and we look to see what's the same, what's different, how are things lining up, and trying to see if we can make sense of the story of what's happening in the world and with people. What is it called when a datum, that's one, does not fit the pattern of the rest of the data? Sometimes we're looking for patterns for everything to be the same, and sometimes the interesting part is when something doesn't fit the patterns, and that is called an outlier. This image of a graph shows the test scores versus performance measured by sales. So this would be a graph you might find at a company where these are test scores that they took from an assessment, and whether they got a high or a low score, we're assuming high score is good. And then it's showing a pretty strong correlation where if you had a higher test score, you also had more sales. And that kind of makes sense. If you're better at this information that they were presenting, then you're better at your job. But there's two outliers on here, employee number 2 and number 19. So maybe this person was really book smart, but had super hard time working with people. And maybe this person, that testing didn't really make sense to them, but they can like convince people to buy. So sometimes the outliers are what's interesting. But also this shows that the test had a strong correlation with performance. Sometimes the outlier is the most significant, and sometimes it just skews the data. Outliers especially have a strong effect on the mean kind of average, where you're taking all the numbers up and adding them together and dividing by how many they are. That kind of average can really be skewed by an outlier. So data tells a story. It helps us understand society. You can see in this graph, it's called International Rates of Incarceration per 100,000 people. So you can see there's the United States seems like a pretty significant amount of people being incarcerated, that means put in jail, for a population of 100,000. This comparison of per 100,000 is important so that we're not just looking at total numbers, because some countries have a lot more people than others. So just looking at the context there in this graph of the numbers, that's really important. But then there's also only certain countries that are included, and we're kind of wondering what's going on. What does this graph tell us? What's the purpose of the graph? What motivations do the people have that made the graph? It's always important also to see, is there anything misleading? Sometimes it's unintentional, but graphs can be misleading. And there's always parts that are missing from the story. There's never a graph that shows you the entire story. And yet, there's a lot of information we can get from data and graphs. And this graph tells a story as well.